review. Book one, I want to tell about the books that I read for the last 40 years. And today I have my special guest. She is a writer, podcaster, and a human activist, no other than Miss Amethysta Herrick.
Hello, how are you doing, Daniel?
I'm fabulous, fabulous like you, Miss Herrick. And can you please introduce more about yourself?
Sure. So, I was born in Southern California. This was the 1970s. And, I grew up in the Reagan era and, all kinds of great influences that came about in the 80s and 90s. So, I started off as a biologist. My education was originally in molecular biology, especially genetics. And then you'll see after my name there, I ended up completing a PhD, but it was in analytical chemistry. And so I learned all kinds of stuff about biology, and then as well as design, how to analyze data. And then finally, what I do today is I write now. I'm a writer, a podcaster, content creator, because in 2022, I transitioned gender to present as a woman. And that was the most profound change I've ever made. Turns out that I never really knew that I could experience emotions before. And so once all of this started occurring, I was much calmer. I could experience emotions, as I said, and I figured I needed to do research on myself. And then I decided I would do research on the transgender community and then later the queer community. And now, finally, what I write about is the origin and nature of gender and identity, because I believe they're both human experiences. And so that's my quick introduction.
Miss Amethysta Henrik or Herrick. Thank you so much for sharing your knowledge to the world.
Sure.
What motivated you to explore the topic of sex through a scientific lens?
Well, both of those words, both sex and gender, have crisp definitions that come from biology. And in the molecular biology education I got, now this was starting in the late 1980s, going into the 1990s, I learned definitions that are certainly far different from what has been written into executive orders by the current administration of the United States. So it's very important to me now to discuss this, because if I don't, what I see is the transgender community being eradicated, if nothing else. We are being, we're being called things that we aren't. We're being accused of actions that we don't take, and I think it's important to combat that.
So, Miss Herrick, what is your comment regarding Mr. Donald Trump only recognized male and female?
Oh gosh, well, this is an interesting topic. There are crisp definitions for both of those two words. I'm going to reserve my comment on the executive order to the end of this, but both of those two words are defined the way science is done, which is to observe the universe, in biology, in the case of biology, to observe nature and the and things that are living. So when biologists started, and this goes way back, um, when biologists started classifying species, they found that there were many species that reproduced through the combination of two little packets of, ultimately we thought of it, we know it as genetic material, but they reproduce through combination of two little bits of material, and they called these gametes. Biologists ultimately defined sex as the contribution of a gamete, a specific gamete, to an act of reproduction. Isn't that deliciously vague? I think it's
Indeed.
lovely. And it is
Indeed.
purposely vague. It is necessarily vague. And it's necessarily vague because biology studies all species. It doesn't look only at humanity. And so when biologists started looking around, they said, "Oh my gosh, we have species. Some species are capable of producing both gametes at the same time for most of their lives. Plants, many plants fall into this category." And then they also found that there were some species that would start off sexual maturity producing one gamete, but then change just as a matter of course. Seahorses are like those. Um, they also found um, there were species that were capable of changing the gamete they produced based on social pressures. So there are fish that we know changed from female into male based on social pressures. So, and then we know mammals in particular, because I'm sure there are people out there going, Amy, I'm not a fish. Good point. Mammals, eh, there is no species that creates gametes at conception. There are very few species that are capable of reproducing about at birth. Most species go through a process of maturation. Then we reach sexual maturity at some point, and now we can actually create those gametes to contribute to acts of reproduction. So this is so deliciously vague because when an organism engages in an act of reproduction, when it contributes the gamete, that's it. It's done. We can define what it is. We can look at the gametes, assuming we're standing around in a somewhat creepy sort of way. We can look at that gamete and recognize what it is, and say, okay, that organism contributed this gamete. But before you get there, it's more of a possibility, a probability, because there are a lot of things that contribute to that. I mentioned stage in life, so that entails genetics and biochemistry. I mentioned there are social pressures. We can look at many mammals and see that some species will engage in homosexual relationships, so that appears cognitive and social. There are some species that only reproduce with particular, like alpha male type organisms in the society, so the social environment. So we're looking at something that is a combination of genetics and biochemistry, physical structure, cognition, behavior, and social environment. And all of that comes together as in a probability that one organism will engage in an act of reproduction and contribute a gamete. And so if I'm going to throw out a definition here, sex is the contribution of a gamete to an act of reproduction, and gender is everything else that it takes to get to that act of reproduction in the first place. It's a probability, it's a possibility. Sex we can define, gender we can define, but it is individual, it is unique to the organism. So I told you I would reserve comment until the end. The reason why I wanted to do that is because this
Yes.
executive order begins by defining male and female by talking about gametes at conception. No species makes gametes at conception. It's somewhat of a ridiculous phrase there to say the gamete created at conception. Um, and I'm misquoting it slightly because it says at conception the gametes associated with. Uh, so, and again, just because you're looking at a combination of genetics, it is possible that environmentally that organism doesn't end up developing the parts that you would expect from the genetics. We see that in humans, we see that in most species, that development of the organism, the offspring, after the combination of gametes, is subject to environment. It's subject, meaning like hunger. Is there enough food? Is there enough nutrition? Is there, do the parents care for them? There's a lot that goes into this. So my comment, you had asked actually about Donald Trump himself, and I'm commenting on his executive order because the executive order from a scientific standpoint is nonsensical. And I believe, you know, Trump sort of rode, well, many of his campaign promises had to do with the transgender community, the gender expansive community. I am I was portrayed, not I personally, but the transgender community was portrayed as a dangerous and a harmful influence on humanity in general. We are portrayed as a group of people who only came into existence in the last like 30 years. And we have historical records of both homosexuality and gender expansive people going back millennia. I mean, easily into the before the Common Era dates. It used to be very common for people to be homosexual or transgender. So the idea that we're all brand new and we need to be regulated out of existence is somewhat foolish, in my opinion. Hopefully, people will look at me and, with the exception of possibly somewhat slightly tinted hair, look at me as just a normal person who went through a bunch of education, a bunch of working in the technology field, and I'm just somebody who's just trying to get along. So I think that's the most comments I want to make. I don't want to be too antagonistic. Certainly, there's a reason why I do what I do, and Donald Trump is part of it. But I like to be positive as opposed to be negative.
Very well said, Miss Herrick. Beautifully articulated.
Thank you.
What do you mean by the real science of sex?
Well, we're told, I mean, we can go back to this executive order. We're told that this is an appeal to science, that we're looking at gametes. And that's correct. Sex does have to do with gametes. But we don't, sex as a, sex, the definition of sex doesn't apply to our lives very frequently. What we see in our individual lives is our own, as I put it, combination of genetics and physical structure, social environment, cognition, behavior. Each of us experiences our sex characteristics differently. And I want to make that distinction there. The real science is that sex is one thing, sex characteristics are different. Sex characteristics include things like physical structure. So, breasts and a vagina, no breasts and a penis, testicles versus ovaries. This is physical structure. These are sex characteristics that might help you contribute a gamete to reproduction. But the idea of saying that any of us can be reduced down to one single characteristic, which is the ability to contribute a gamete to reproduction, is not scientific. The real science has to do with much of our lives are not taking much of our lives are not in reproduction. I know many of us. I know there are teenagers out there saying, I wish my whole life was engaging in acts of reproduction. Safely, presumably. Make sure you're all being safe out there, please, kids. But much of our lives do not is not the act of reproduction, and so that is the science of it. The real science is that we live lives not really all that concerned with reproduction. Humans, that is. There are certainly many species that don't, that live for the sake of reproducing and perpetuating the species. Humans do not. And I think it's dangerous, ultimately, dangerous and harmful, I might even throw out there, to pretend that humans can be characterized so bluntly. So that's why I'm concerned about it. I think that answered your question. Did I? Might have.
Indeed, Miss Herrick. So, how has the modern science changed our understanding of human sexuality?
What's interesting is I don't think. Okay, I was going to say the definition of sex and the definition of gender are old, old. We didn't need modern science. All you have to do is look around. The original purpose of a scientist was to look around. How does the universe work? So, modern science, the way modern science has affected this, and I find this interesting, is that many, I mean, including biologists, many biologists I know have said, well, sex is very difficult to describe. Sex is composed of sex characteristics. And I think there's a mix up there. I don't want to say this in an antagonistic way. I think that we tend to mix up sex with sex characteristics, whether or not somebody has functioning ovaries or testicles, with the actual act of reproduction, because those testicles and ovaries contributing to physical structure are aspects of gender. So the way modern science at this point, I believe, has contributed to this debate, for lack of a better way of saying it, I think we dropped the ball. I think we let humanity down. Let,
Yes.
let me explain this.
Go ahead.
I think that scientists, when gender became something that we really needed to talk about here in the United States, and I'm still unsure why that's such a hot topic, but when we started talking about this, I wish scientists had stood up and said, "Well, hang on. Those words you're using there have definitions, and those definitions come from my science, not your politics." And so now we have people today who hear politicians define words, and modern scientists have dropped the ball on that. We haven't challenged that. We haven't reclaimed these words, which would be important. I think it's really important that science comes back and says, "Listen, we own these words. We define these words. And as a result, we're going to tell you how they work." Now, an executive order is very different from a law, obviously. And I mean, as we're seeing in action, right? Courts keep on slapping down some of these executive orders and some of the actions they demand. So let me end with that. Modern science at this point, I'm somewhat disappointed in the way that we've handled this, and I think that's part of why I've started talking about it, why I've tried to be more vocal about it, is because I am a scientist, and I am somewhat concerned about politicians using words that that have definitions, but using them in ways to fulfill their political agenda.
So, Miss Herrick, as a writer, podcaster, and a human activist, what are your short term and long term goals?
Mm, gosh, right now I'm going through a rebranding. My very, very short term goals in the next month is to complete this rebranding effort and make it so that I can market myself more effectively, get this message out to more people, hopefully. Um, Longer term, at this point, I've written, gosh, I don't even know, 150, 170 articles over the last 2.5 years or so. I was writing much more prolifically at the end of 2022, at the beginning of my writing career. I'm writing less now. Now I'm making more video content and podcasting. But there is there is at least one book that I'd like to write. I think much of that would be putting together the content that I've already written, um, and much of that comes from my experience growing up as a transgender girl, and then how I went into the field of science, going into the field of technology, because I assumed that was the only way I could actually survive. And then finally, all this discovery that I've done, not just about myself, not just about my community, but all of humanity. And so I think there's at least one book that goes into that. I also have been very heavily influenced by spiritual by spiritual authors. Anyway, oh, that seems also delightfully vague. I may as well go back to the definition of sex here. um, I've always been very interested in philosophy, and so I've read a lot about metaphysics. I've read a lot about religious philosophy, in particular Eastern philosophies. Indian philosophy was probably the one I studied the most so far, and so I actually feel there's it's possible to locate the human experience, um, within each one of us, but then in a greater capacity, we have the tendency, especially in the United States, to look only at an individual and to say, well, what is the individual uh, what is the individual experience? And I believe very strongly in the idea of individual rights. Certainly, as laid out. I mean, originally this was the Declaration of Independence, but the bless you,
Thank you.
the the rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. But I believe we can locate that in a more holistic idea of each of our experiences contributing to a greater whole. So each of us is an individual, but we necessarily live within a social environment. We can't really get away from that. That's just the way humanity works. So we are, I mean, especially as mammals, right? When you're born, you're not able to go out and get a job with a drill and, pay rent.
Yes.
Some, Sometimes I wish our kid could have done that, but anyway,
True.
that didn't happen. So in any event, we are individuals, but we are necessarily within a social environment, and I think there are ways to bring those two together that respect the individual but advance the social environment at the same time. And so these are, you would ask for my long-term goals. I want to finish branding. I want rebranding. I'd love to start looking at books, a couple of books that I'd like to write, and then long term I would like to change the course of I would like to change the course of human history. I feel like Arthur C. Clarke all of a sudden. I'd like to change the course of human history by demonstrating that humans are part of a greater whole, that each one of us is part of a greater whole. So there we go.
Good luck. Good luck to your goals,
Thank you.
Miss Herrick, and more success. And
Thank
what
you.
will be your advice for those people out there who want to be true to themselves?
Oh my gosh, what a phenomenal question. Thank you for asking that. I believe so my philosophy on identity is actually twofold. The first part of it is that your identity belongs to you and you alone. Society has no claim on that. That's not. It's nobody else can tell you who you are, what you're supposed to be. Nobody can tell you that. The other part of it, part two of that, is that our purpose as humans is to fulfill who we are, to develop our identity and to express that into our social environment, because to do so contributes to that greater whole that I was telling you about. And I think that's extremely important. So that is my you would ask for practical advice. That first practical advice: trust yourself. Trust yourself. There's a reason you know what you know. It comes from inside and that belongs to you. So hopefully that was sufficient.
Yes, indeed, Ms. Herrick. So, can you discuss the difference between sexual health and sexual behavior from a scientific perspective?
Oh my gosh. Um, that is a very large question. Sexual, I would almost prefer to defer to some of my colleagues. Leah Spasova, in particular, I don't know if anybody will see this, but um, or will go to her. I'm not sure what I'm trying to say here. Leah Spasova is one of the people I would actually direct people to in terms of sexual health. Sexual behavior, of course, is the act of getting into an act of reproduction, but I think there are good and healthy and hmm there are ways of engaging in reproduction, engaging in sex, let's say, um, that contribute to your identity in a positive way, and then there are ways that contribute in a negative way. And just super briefly, when I was younger, when I was in graduate school, I'll just say this: when I was in my mid 20s, I had a couple of years where I was pretty promiscuous, and I wasn't concerned with sexual health at all. I wasn't concerned with having sex in a way that made me feel good, and that contributed ultimately to my confidence and my identity. Wasn't interested in that. And I would certainly recommend anybody who's going to have sex do it in a way that's going to be fun and that's going to make you feel good about yourself. And that's again, I think where I will defer to Leah Spasova um, for her expertise there.
So, Ms. Herrick, before we wrap up our discussion for today, I'm inviting you to please do listen to my other podcast because Abstract Essay is already in its fifth season. People, Abstract Poetry in second season, and of course, Book 101 Review in its fifth season, Comedy 101 in second season, and Food 101 it's in fifth season as well. Geography 101 and Love Letters are in third season, and my baby podcast, Mental Health 101 and Movie 101 Review and Music 101 is in third season. So please do listen to them wherever you listen your podcast. So Miss Herrick, how do you address the intersection of science and ethics in discussions around sexuality?
I think I did that with my definition, with my recommendations on identity. Your identity belongs to you. Go out and express it because your social environment needs it. That is the entire intersection.
Indeed, interesting, Ms. Herrick. And again, thank you so much for sharing your knowledge to the world. Keep up the good work and make humanity more interesting. So, can you please invite our listeners to support your podcast, your books, or your articles, and as a human activist?
Yes, absolutely. The best way you can do that if you want to engage with me, you can go to Amethysta. So it's AMETHYSTA.io. And so that is my personal website. I did mention I'm doing a rebranding, but until then, my professional website is genderidentitytoday.com. And if you so on my personal website, you can find all the social media networks I'm on and go and follow me there like you do. And then if you go to Gender Identity Today, you can see all of the thought leadership that I'm doing, and read and subscribe if you like. Also on my personal website is a link to ko-fi.com, ko-fi.com. And if you wanted to like leave a tip or something, that's the other way to do it. So that's how it can be supported. Thank you for that.
Yes, indeed. Again, Miss Tia Herrick, PhD. Thank you so much for sharing your knowledge to the
Thank you.
world. And again, we are looking for more and more and more empowering episodes of your podcast and more empowering articles and books to come.
Thank
So,
you.
Miss Herrick, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.
More to come, people. See you soon.